The mahogany conference table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights as thunder rolled across the October sky outside Whitmore and Associates. Sarah Chin sat rigid in her chair, hands clenched in her lap, watching her stepmother Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drum against the leather portfolio containing their father's last will and testament. "Let's get this over with," muttered her half-brother Marcus, checking his Rolex with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. At 35, he'd spent the last decade managing their father's construction empire while Sarah had been dismissed as the artistic one, first to art school, then to teaching at the local community college. Attorney James Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Rain pelted the windows in sheets, matching the storm brewing in Sarah's chest as she prepared for the inevitable. She knew what was coming. Marcus would inherit the business, Victoria the house, and she'd receive some token gesture, if anything at all. "To my beloved son Marcus," Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "I leave Chin Construction and all associated assets." Marcus leaned back with a satisfied smirk while Victoria squeezed his shoulder triumphantly. Sarah's breath caught as the attorney continued. "To my wife Victoria, the family home and—" The list went on: bank accounts, investments, the lake house. Then came her name. "To my daughter Sarah, I leave my workshop Toolbox and all its contents." The room erupted in barely contained laughter. Marcus actually snorted. "A toolbox? Dad always said you couldn't tell a hammer from a screwdriver." But Sarah remembered something else, her father's calloused hands teaching her to measure twice, cut once. And his whispered words, "Sometimes the most valuable things hide in plain sight." The weight of humiliation pressed against Sarah's chest as she drove through the rain-slicked streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The rusted toolbox rattled in her passenger seat, a cruel joke that had reduced her to tears in front of the people who'd already written her off. But as windshield wipers swept away the downpour, memories began flooding back with startling clarity. 23 years ago, 8-year-old Sarah had spent every Saturday in her father's workshop while Marcus played video games upstairs. David Chen had been a man of few words, but his hands spoke volumes as he showed her how to sand wood grain, how to read blueprints, how to build something lasting from nothing. "Construction isn't just about buildings, little bird," he'd whispered, using his pet name for her. "It's about foundations. And foundations must be built on truth." She treasured those moments until her mother died when Sarah was 12. Within a year, Victoria had swept into their lives like a perfectly coiffed hurricane, bringing 15-year-old Marcus with her. Suddenly, the workshop became no place for a young lady, and Sarah found herself pushed toward more appropriate pursuits. Her father, drowning in grief and Victoria's relentless charm, had seemed to forget their Saturday rituals entirely. What Sarah hadn't known then was the secret eating away at her father's empire. In 1987, David Chen had been a struggling contractor when Vinny Torino approached him with an offer too good to refuse. The Torino family needed someone to launder money through construction projects, fake contracts, inflated materials costs, workers who existed only on paper. David had convinced himself it was temporary, just until he could establish his business legitimately. But the mob's hooks had sunk deep. By the time Sarah was born, Chen Construction was built on a foundation of lies, and David lived in constant fear that his daughter would discover her comfortable life was paid for with blood money. The workshop had become his sanctuary of honesty, the one place where his hands created something real, something clean. Marcus, however, had embraced the family's dark legacy with enthusiasm. At 18, he'd started making deliveries for the Torinos, convincing himself he was just helping with business relationships. Victoria knew nothing of her husband's criminal ties, but she'd grown suspicious of the cash payments and mysterious phone calls that sent David into panicked late-night meetings. 3 months before his death, David had finally found the courage to approach FBI agent Jennifer Walsh. The construction magnate everyone admired was ready to bring down the empire he'd built on corruption. But Vinny Torino had eyes everywhere, including inside the local police department. David knew his time was running out. Sarah pulled into her small apartment complex, the toolbox feeling heavier with each step. Inside her cramped living room, she set it on her coffee table and stared at the faded red paint and rust stains. The lock was old-fashioned, requiring a key she didn't have. But wait, she did have a key. Her trembling fingers found the thin silver chain she'd worn since childhood, a gift from her father on her 13th birthday. She'd assumed it was decorative, but now. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. Inside, beneath an organized layer of well-used tools, she found something that made her blood run cold. Manila envelopes stuffed with photographs, financial documents, and a letter in her father's careful handwriting. The photos showed Marcus shaking hands with men Sarah recognized from newspaper crime stories. The documents detailed years of money laundering, with Marcus's signature on dozens of fraudulent invoices. And the letter began, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then the truth can no longer be buried." Before we continue this gripping story, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let us know what country or city you're tuning in from. It's amazing to see how stories of family, betrayal, and justice resonate across different cultures and continents. The rain continued to pound against her windows as Sarah realized her worthless inheritance was actually a loaded gun pointed at the heart of everything she'd thought she knew about her family. And somewhere in the darkness of Millbrook, powerful people would kill to keep these secrets buried. Sarah's hands shook as she spread the photographs across her kitchen table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Each image told a story of corruption that reached deeper than she'd ever imagined. Marcus wasn't just involved with the Torinos, he was their golden boy, the legitimate face that allowed them to bid on city contracts worth millions. But it was the final photograph that stopped her heart cold. Marcus and Victoria together, sharing what appeared to be an intimate conversation with Vinnie Torino outside the Millbrook City Hall. The timestamp showed it was taken just 2 weeks before her father's sudden heart attack. David's letter revealed the crushing truth. He'd been planning to testify against the Torino family, but someone had leaked his cooperation to the mob. The heart attack that killed him hadn't been natural, it had been induced by a rare toxin that mimicked cardiac arrest. Her father had suspected Marcus of the betrayal, but he'd never imagined Victoria was involved too. "They're not just stealing from the city," David had written in his meticulous script. "They're planning something that will destroy thousands of lives. The new Riverside development isn't what it seems. The soil reports are falsified. They're building luxury condos on contaminated land that will poison everyone who lives there. The grand opening is scheduled for Christmas Day. You have to stop them." Sarah felt the walls of her small apartment closing in. Her father had died trying to prevent a catastrophe, and now the burden fell to her. But who could she trust? The local police were compromised, and she had no idea how high the corruption reached. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your father was a good man. If you want justice, meet me at Murphy's Diner tomorrow at 8 p.m. Come alone. A friend." Sleep eluded Sarah that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was walking into a trap. But what choice did she have? By morning, she'd made her decision. She carefully photographed every document, uploading them to a secure cloud storage account, and left copies with her neighbor, an elderly woman who'd been her father's friend for decades. Murphy's Diner sat on the edge of town like a relic from a simpler time. Sarah arrived early, choosing a booth with clear sightlines to both entrances. At exactly 8 p.m., a woman in her 40s slid into the seat across from her. She had kind eyes but carried herself with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "I'm Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI," the woman said quietly, showing her credentials. "Your father was helping us build a case against the Torino organization. When he died, we thought we'd lost our only inside source." Sarah's relief was overwhelming. Finally, someone who understood the magnitude of what they were facing. But Agent Walsh's next words sent ice through her veins. "We've been monitoring communications since your father's death. Marcus is accelerating the Riverside development timeline. The groundbreaking ceremony is this Friday, 3 days from now. Once those families start moving in, people will get sick," Sarah finished. "Cancer, birth defects, poisoned groundwater. Hundreds of families. Maybe thousands over time." Walsh leaned forward. But here's what your father didn't know before he died. We've been tracking offshore accounts tied to this project. The Torinos aren't just building on contaminated land, they're being paid by chemical companies to dispose of additional toxic waste beneath the foundation. It's a dumping ground disguised as luxury housing. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Sarah thought of the children who would play in those poisoned yards, the families who would trust that their dream homes were safe. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Access. Your father's documents prove the financial conspiracy, but we need evidence of the environmental crimes. Marcus has been storing soil samples and contamination reports in your father's old office. We've tried to get warrants, but Judge Morrison is in the Torino's pocket. We need someone with legal access to the building." Sarah's mind raced. As David Chen's daughter, she still had rights to retrieve personal belongings from the office. But walking into Chen Construction meant facing Marcus and Victoria, knowing what she now knew about their role in her father's murder. Hey everyone, if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us bring you more gripping stories like this one. Every subscription and like makes a real difference. Agent Walsh slid a small device across the table. This will copy computer files wirelessly. Get me into that office, and we can save those families before it's too late. As Sarah pocketed the device, she realized she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Tomorrow, she would have to look her father's killers in the eye and pretend she was still the naive art teacher they'd dismissed. The toolbox that had seemed like a cruel joke was actually her father's final gift, the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached from City Hall to the highest levels of organized crime. But first, she had to survive long enough to use it. Friday morning arrived with deceptive calm, sunlight streaming through the windows of Chin Construction's glass-fronted office building. Sarah stood before the receptionist's desk, her father's business card trembling in her hand as she requested access to collect his personal items. The weight of Agent Walsh's device in her jacket pocket felt like carrying a live grenade. "Of course, dear," the receptionist cooed with false sympathy. "Mr. Marcus is expecting you in the conference room first, though." Sarah's blood turned to ice. This wasn't part of the plan. The conference room doors opened to reveal Marcus lounging in their father's chair, Victoria beside him with that predatory smile Sarah had grown to hate. But it was the third figure that made her knees weak, Vincent Torino himself, his dead eyes studying her with the intensity of a shark sizing up prey. "Sarah, sweetheart," Victoria purred, "we need to have a little family discussion." Marcus leaned forward, all pretense of brotherly affection gone. "Funny thing happened yesterday. Someone broke into Dad's workshop, tore the place apart looking for something." Sarah's mind raced. They knew. Somehow, they knew about the toolbox. "We know Dad left you more than just rusty tools." Torino spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "He was always too sentimental. Probably thought his little girl could handle the truth about what he really was." "A rat," Marcus spat. "Dad was going to destroy everything we built. Everything I earned." "You earned?" Sarah found her voice, anger overriding fear. "You mean everything you stole? Those families moving into Riverside, do you even care that you're poisoning them?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh honey, you think this is about environmental violations? This is about survival. Your father threatened to expose operations worth hundreds of millions. He signed his own death warrant the moment he contacted the FBI." The admission hung in the air like a physical blow. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Torino stood slowly, his massive frame blocking the exit. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give us everything your old man left you. Every document, every photograph. Then you're going to take a little trip to visit him." But as Torino reached into his jacket, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap: sirens. Multiple vehicles, getting closer. Marcus jumped to his feet. "What the hell dash?" The conference room windows exploded inward as FBI agents rappelled from the building's roof. Agent Walsh burst through the main entrance, weapon drawn, shouting commands as tactical teams flooded the building. "Nobody move. FBI." In the chaos, Sarah realized the brilliant trap her father had set. The documents in the toolbox weren't just evidence, they were bait. Agent Walsh had been monitoring the building since Sarah's arrival, waiting for the conspiracy to reveal itself completely. But Torino was faster than his bulk suggested. He grabbed Sarah, pressing a gun to her temple as the tactical team surrounded them. "Everyone back off or the girl dies." "Vincent, let her go," Agent Walsh commanded, her weapon trained on the mobster. "It's over. We have everything, the financial records, the contamination reports, recordings of this entire conversation." "Recordings?" Victoria's face went white. Sarah smiled through her tears. "The device Agent Walsh gave me wasn't just for copying files. It's been broadcasting everything to the FBI since I walked in here." Marcus lunged toward the window, but agents were ready. As they tackled him to the ground, he screamed with rage. "You destroyed everything. Dad built this empire for us." "Dad built it on lies," Sarah shot back, "and you murdered him to keep those lies alive." Torino's grip tightened on her neck, but his options were evaporating. Through the shattered windows, Sarah could see news crews arriving, police cordoning off the Riverside development site. The families who would have moved into those poisoned homes were being evacuated to safety. "Your father would be proud," Agent Walsh said quietly, maintaining her aim. "He died trying to save innocent people. Now you've finished what he started." The standoff ended when Torino, faced with dozens of weapons and no escape route, finally released Sarah and surrendered. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked at her with something approaching respect. "Your old man taught you well, kid. But this isn't over. The Torino family has long memories." "So does the FBI," Agent Walsh replied coldly. As they led the criminals away, Sarah stood in the wreckage of the conference room, watching her father's killers face justice at last. The worthless toolbox had been worth everything, not for what it contained, but for what it represented. Her father's final lesson: sometimes the smallest key opens the biggest doors. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the witness box of the federal district court, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had brought down one of Pennsylvania's most entrenched criminal organizations. The courtroom was packed with families who would have been poisoned, reporters documenting the fall of the Torino empire, and FBI agents who had worked tirelessly to untangle decades of corruption. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit unable to mask the hollow defeat in his eyes. Victoria, facing charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder, had aged dramatically in custody. Her perfectly styled facade had crumbled, revealing the desperate opportunist beneath. Vincent Torino, already serving life without parole for David Chen's murder, watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a man who knew his criminal legacy was being systematically dismantled. The evidence Sarah had preserved in her father's toolbox had been devastating. The FBI's forensic accountants had traced over $200 million in laundered money through Chen Construction, leading to the indictment of 12 city officials, 3 judges, and an entire network of corrupt contractors. The environmental crimes were even more staggering. Soil samples revealed contamination levels that would have caused birth defects and cancers for generations. During a recess, Agent Walsh approached Sarah in the hallway. "The jury's about to deliver verdicts," she said quietly. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. The past months had been a whirlwind of depositions, media interviews, and the painful process of learning just how deeply the corruption had penetrated her childhood. Every memory of her father had been recontextualized through the lens of his hidden life, his late-night phone calls, his increasing isolation, the way he'd pushed her away from the construction business. But the letter he'd left in the toolbox had revealed his deepest regret. In pages of careful handwriting, David had confessed that pushing Sarah away from the business hadn't been about gender stereotypes. It had been about protecting her from the criminal world that had enslaved him. He'd seen her artistic nature, her moral clarity, and knew she could never survive in the environment that had corrupted Marcus so completely. "I spent years trying to build something clean for you and your brother," David had written. "But the harder I worked to escape the Torinos, the deeper they pulled me in. By the time Marcus joined the business, I realized I had created a monster." He wasn't just willing to continue the criminal enterprise, he embraced it. He became everything I had tried to protect you both from. The most devastating revelation had come in the letter's final pages. David had discovered that Marcus was planning to expand the toxic waste disposal operation beyond the Riverside development. Working with chemical companies across 3 states, Marcus had proposed turning Chin Construction into a permanent dumping service, disguised as legitimate development projects. Thousands of families would have been poisoned over the next decade, all so Marcus could build his criminal empire. Your brother came to me 3 weeks ago, David had written, demanding that I sign over complete control of the company. When I refused, he made it clear that my choice was simple: give him the business or watch him destroy you too. That's when I knew I had to contact the FBI, regardless of the consequences to myself. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grim with the weight of justice. The foreman stood, reading verdicts that would reshape the landscape of organized crime in Pennsylvania. Marcus received 47 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Victoria got 15 years for her role in the conspiracy. The network of corrupt officials received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. But it was the civil trial that followed that truly honored David Chen's sacrifice. The families who would have lived in the poisoned Riverside development received a settlement of $300 million from the criminal enterprise's seized assets. The contaminated land was purchased by the EPA for proper cleanup, ensuring it could never again threaten innocent lives. Sarah found herself the reluctant inheritor of Chin Construction's legitimate assets. With guidance from federal prosecutors, she chose to liquidate the company and establish the David Chin Foundation for Environmental Justice. The foundation would work to identify contaminated sites hidden by corporate corruption and ensure families had the resources to seek justice when their health was threatened by criminal negligence. The emotional cost of the revelations had been staggering. Sarah had to confront the reality that her comfortable childhood had been built on blood money, that the brother she'd looked up to was capable of murder, and that the stepmother who'd raised her had been complicit in her father's death. Trust became a precious commodity, doled out carefully to the few people who had proven their integrity under pressure. Agent Walsh had become an unexpected ally and friend. During the long months of trials and depositions, she'd helped Sarah understand that carrying her father's guilt wasn't her responsibility. Your father made mistakes, Walsh had told her, but he spent the last years of his life trying to make amends. That's the legacy worth preserving. The hardest moment had come when Sarah visited Marcus in federal prison. He sat across from her in the visiting room, his face a mask of bitterness and entitlement that made her stomach turn. You destroyed everything, he'd said without preamble. Dad was weak, but I could have made Chin Construction into something powerful. Something that mattered. At the cost of how many lives? Sarah had replied. Those families, Marcus. Children who would have grown up poisoned because of your greed. You don't understand how the world really works, Marcus had sneered. Dad filled your head with fairy tales about honest construction and clean money. But power requires compromise. It requires doing things that weak people can't stomach. It requires becoming someone I could never respect, Sarah had answered, standing to leave. Dad wasn't weak for trying to save those families. He was brave for finally choosing to do what was right, even though it cost him everything. As she'd walked away from the prison, Sarah realized that was the last conversation she would ever have with her half-brother. The boy who'd once taught her to ride a bike had become a stranger whose moral compass pointed only toward profit and power. The true revelation that brought peace was hidden in her father's final letter. He'd known that only Sarah would understand the real value of the toolbox, not just as evidence, but as a symbol of honest work and authentic creation. You always understood that building something beautiful requires a foundation of truth, he'd written. That's why I trust you with this burden, little bird. Because you'll know how to use it to heal instead of destroy. 2 years after that rain-soaked afternoon in the lawyer's office, Sarah stood in the workshop she'd rebuilt behind her new home. The original tools from her father's red toolbox hung on pegboard walls, each one cleaned and sharpened, ready for honest work. Through the window, she could see the community garden she'd helped establish on the former site of the Riverside development, families growing healthy food in soil that had been cleansed and made safe. The Davidson Foundation had grown beyond her wildest expectations, exposing corporate environmental crimes across 7 states and helping hundreds of families find justice. But the real healing had come from rediscovering her father's true legacy, not the criminal empire built on lies, but the quiet Saturday mornings when he'd taught her that creating something beautiful required patience, precision, and integrity. Marcus remained in prison, still bitter and unrepentant. Victoria had been released after serving 8 years, disappearing into witness protection rather than facing the families she'd helped poison. The Torino organization had been dismantled, its assets redistributed to their victims. On her desk sat a framed photograph of 8-year-old Sarah and her father, sawdust in their hair, grinning over a birdhouse they'd built together. Next to it, David's final words: "Sometimes the most valuable things hide in plain sight, little bird. But only those with honest hearts can see their true worth." The worthless toolbox had saved hundreds of lives and restored a daughter's faith in justice. In the end, her father's greatest construction project hadn't been a building at all. It had been ensuring that truth would survive long enough to heal the wounds his mistakes had created. If you enjoyed this story of family secrets, justice, and redemption, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more gripping historical dramas. We explore the human stories behind headlines, the family conflicts that shape destinies, and the moments when ordinary people find the courage to do extraordinary things. What other historical mysteries or family dramas would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.